Shalom, friends. Welcome to the Shiur in Gemara. We're studying Masechet Berachot, Tractate Blessings. I'm Eliyahu Shir from Chesed Ve'emet, and you can find my site on www.lovingkindness.co. We're using the beautiful Koren Talmud Bavli edition, so everybody can follow along. We have the original text in front of us in the Hebrew Aramaic. We also have the English translation notes. We have biographies of the various rabbis, pictures, illustrations, diagrams, notes, halachot. We have a whole cholent of information that can help us understand the Gemara a little bit easier. So please do follow along with me. And if there's anything that I miss out on or something, just read along on the notes on the side to fill yourself in something I might have missed out or whatever the case may be. So let us begin. We're actually on page Yud Tet Amud Aleph, that is Daf 19, side A. And we were discussing the themes of whether the dead know what is happening in this world or not. And we spoke about some various stories, and it was a very exciting section for those of you who wish to brush up on whether when one leaves this world, whether one has knowledge of this world or not. Please go back to the previous shiur. Now we're continuing from that theme, and thereafter we're branching out onto some further themes as we continue in our discussion in this Gemara. So the Gemara continues over here and says, Omar Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak said, Kol ha-mesaper acharei ha-meis, anybody who speaks after the dead, which means to say that he speaks in a certain sense which is negative. Of course, practically speaking, we could say if he speaks even something positive, but certainly when one speaks something negative, ki ilu mesaper acharei ha'even, it is as if he is speaking after a stone, which means to say that the dead, as we discussed in the previous shiur, whether or not they have knowledge of what is happening in this world, according to Rabbi Yitzchak, it seems to be that when we say certain things about them, they don't seem to know really what's going on. You may as well be speaking about a stone. Ikeda Amri, there are those that say, Delo Yadi, that they don't know anything about what we're speaking about. We could be speaking about somebody right now in this shiur who passed on, left this world, and they have no idea that we're speaking about them. The Ikeda Amri, and there are those that say, the Yadi, that they do know. But they don't care. It doesn't matter what we say about them, for good or for bad. It doesn't seem to make any impact on where they are at this point in time. Speak about them, don't speak about them. What's the difference? The Gemara continues. Ini, is that so? Really, that's very interesting, you say. V'ho amar Rav Papa. But didn't Rav Papa say the following? Chad ishta'ei milta batrei demar Shmuel. There was a certain individual who spoke a thing after Mar Shmuel had died, so they spoke about him in a certain sense, in other words, in a negative sense. Unfal kanya mitzlala ubezea la'arnaka demoiche, and a beam, a reed, fell from the ceiling, and it split his skull. Somebody was speaking after the great rabbi had already passed on. He said some things that were obviously not appropriate. And it turns out that one of the reeds from the ceiling, a beam, fell down and smashed his skull and split it open. Shiny turva merabanan. So it seems to be that the dead do know about what is happening. And since this particular individual spoke badly about the great rabbi, so he was punished. Perhaps the dead spirit, caused the reeds or the beam from the ceiling to fall and gave him this particular punishment, the ghost of this particular sage. So the Gemara says, no, that's not what happens. Shaine turva merabanan. When it comes to Torah scholars, it's a whole different story altogether. They're different. Why? Meaning, even though they themselves don't know what's going on, the Kudshe Brichu Tava Bikarei. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be he claims, in other words, he demands his honor to be upheld, which means to say that since it is that he's a Torah scholar, God demands that he have respect. And since this particular fellow spoke so badly about the great sage. Therefore, Hashem took vengeance, so to speak, upon the individual who spoke badly about one of God's servants. Omar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, Kol hamisaper achar mitasan shel talmidei chachamim nofel bagei hinum. Anybody who speaks after the bier, B-I-E-R, after the coffin of the Talmidei Chachamim, which obviously is an expression which means that anybody who speaks badly about a Talmid Chacham, a student of Torah, after the person has died, says Nofel B'Gehenom, he will fall into hell. He will die and he will go to an unpleasant place. Sheneemar. How do we know that? If you're going to make a statement like that, you have to back it up with some sort of proof. Here is the proof from a verse in the book of Tehillim. V'hamatim akalkalotam yolichem Hashem es po'alei ha'aven shalom al Yisrael. Which means that those who turn aside onto their crooked ways, Hashem will lead them away with the workers of iniquity. Peace upon Israel, which means to say, those who turn aside from their crooked ways, meaning to say what? Afilu b'sha'ah shalom al Yisrael, even when there is peace upon the Jewish people, meaning to say, after death, when they are no longer able to fight those denouncing them, nevertheless, Yolichem Hashem es po'alei ha'avin. The Lord will lead them away with the workers of iniquity to Gehenna. Let's take a look at the notes here. We see the language, hiskal arnika demochei. Arnika is from this Greek word meaning sheepskin. Ultimately, it included other items as well, especially purses made from sheepskin. After the beers of Torah scholars, the standard explanation of this phrase is a euphemism for after their death. As the sages said, the righteous, even after their death, are called alive. This we've discussed before already. Variant readings have this explicitly as after their death. Others explain after the Torah scholars have strayed, which has an etymological similarity in Hebrew, from the path of righteousness, evoking the verse, those who turn aside unto their crooked ways. Then God will take vengeance, basically, and hold them liable, leading them off into Gehenna. The Gemara continues. Tana devei Rabbi Yishmael. It was taught in the school of Rabbi Yishmael. A new subject. Imra isa talmid chacham. If you see a Torah scholar, she'avara ve'ere balayla, and he committed a sin at night time, al tahaher acharav bayom. Do not think, do not wonder about him, meaning in the daytime. Don't worry about him, what he's just done. Shema asa teshuvah, because maybe he already did teshuvah. The Gemara says, meaning because he's a Talmid Chacham, if he does something that's wrong, he's probably aware of it, and already he's doing teshuvah. Shema salka daitach, the Gemara asks, maybe, is that what you think? Is that what enters your mind to say, that maybe he did teshuvah? Ella, but rather, since he's a Talmid Chacham, vadai asa teshuvah, it is certain that he did repentance. Vahane mile. And these words, when we say that the Torah scholar, the Talmid Chacham, has done teshuvah on the action that he did, is b'dvarim shebekufo. These are things that pertain to his body. Aval b'bamoina, but things that pertain to money, for example, he stole money from somebody, ad demahadar lemare. Then we say that the teshuvah only takes place once he has returned the money back to the owner of the money, and we don't trust that he did teshuvah, which means to say that when one sees a Talmid Chacham in the process of an Aveira, we must assume that already he's engaged as very soon afterwards in the process of teshuvah. Chances are by the time he went to sleep that night, he was thinking about what he did wrong, and he has done teshuvah. Of course, we're talking about a real Talmid Chacham. We're talking about somebody who is involved in Torah. He makes it a serious business to work on himself. When one sees such an individual working on himself and he's putting the effort in, and one sees that something catches him one day and it seems like he's involved in a certain Aveira, we have to judge him favorably, as of course we're supposed to judge everybody favorably. We should assume that everybody is doing teshuvah. But the Gemara is pointing out for us the concept of the Talmid Chacham, that we assume that indeed he does teshuvah. When does this apply? It applies to things related to his body. But if we're talking about money, where he stole money from somebody, there we say we do not believe that he did teshuvah until he returns the money back to the owner. V'omar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, the Gemara continues, new subject. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said the following: Be'esrim v'arba'a makomot, in 24 places, Beit Din menadin al kavod harav. The Beit Din can excommunicate, can ostracize, can put into excommunication on the honor, for the sake of the honor of the rabbi, which means to say that the rabbi has a certain position of authority, and therefore we're supposed to give respect, due respect, to the learned Torah scholar. And in the event that people are negligent and are not prepared to offer their honor towards this individual, for example, he might be a dayan, he might be a judge, a rabbinical judge in the courts, and if the average person is going to behave in an insulting manner towards him, well, of course, we won't have proper judges being able to judge the Jewish people, because if people see him in a low light, because people make fun of him and scoff at him, there'll never be the ability for him to judge, and the Jewish people will be without a judge. Nobody to take care of their affairs when it comes to legal matters within the community that need to be resolved, and other matters, of course, as well. So it says that for 24 things, the Beit Din can excommunicate for the sake of the honor of the rabbi. V'kulan shaninu v'mishnah seinu, and all of them have been taught in our Mishnah. What exactly does it mean? All of them are taught in our Mishnah. Are we speaking specifically about our Mishnah that we're learning at this point in time? Or are we speaking about in general from the Mishnah various places? Amale Rabbi Elazar responded to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Heicha, that's interesting. Where do you see this? 24 things that the Beit Din can excommunicate for on the honor of the rabbi. Where do you find that? Amalei said to him, L'chi tishkach, go and find it yourself. Go and search out yourself. You'll see, if you pay attention, you'll see where they are. Interesting answer. Nefak. So he went off. Dak, he analyzed. Vashkach telat. Turns out he found 3 different points that discuss the issue of excommunication. And these are them. Hamzalzel benetilas yadayim, somebody who is negligent, who looks down upon, who demeans washing one's hands. You have to wash our hands at times. We wash our hands when it comes to eating bread. We wash our hands when it comes to various parts of ritual purity, etc. One who is mezalzel, one who demeans washing their hands, is liable to be put into excommunication because they are demeaning the rabbinical enactment of washing one's hands. Another one, somebody who speaks after the beer, meaning somebody who speaks after the death of Talmidei Chachamim, when somebody speaks badly about a Talmid Chacham who has passed on, he's also liable to be excommunicated. And somebody who acts in an arrogant manner towards heaven, which means that he acts disrespectfully towards God in whatever it is that he's doing. Let us see more about it. The Gemara asks, one who speaks after the death of the Torah scholars. Give an example. What is it? Ditnan. We learned, as it was taught in a Mishnah. This is what we learned. Hu haya omer, he used to say, Ein mashkin lo et hagioret. Who was this he? Yeah, we have to take a look at the commentaries, of course, because as you can see in the Gemara doesn't tell us who the person is that we're speaking about. Of course, already the translator, Rabbi Stanzaltz, has already put in for us who it was. He's already looked at Rashi and he's added the words in. Obviously, these additional words that we see whenever we're reading all of these parts of the additional material, it's usually because the commentaries are pointing out what we need to understand to fill in the gaps. And if not, we have to understand the logic of it, which the translator and explainer Rabbi Stanzaltz has already done for us. So we learned in the Mishnah that Akavia ben Mahalalel, everybody knows Akavia ben Mahalalel, famous for a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. So over there it says he used to say that Ein mashkin lo es hagioris velo es hamashuchreres. We do not give, and what does this mean, mashkin, that we don't give the waters, we don't give the liquid. It refers to the soita waters, that we don't give the soita waters, meaning to say, in the case of a woman whose husband suspects her of adultery, who was warned by her husband not to seclude herself with another man, and she did not listen. So it says that the court does not administer the bitter water potion of soita to who is this? To the giores, to the converts, velo es hameshuchreres, and also not to the slave who has been freed, the emancipated maidservant. The Chachamim omrim, and the Chachamim say, mashkin, we do administer the soita waters to these people. V'amru lo, and they said to him, which means they spoke out to Akavia ben Mahalalel, Maise beKarkamit. There was a story in Karkamit. Shivcha Meshuchreres b'Yerushalayim. There was a maidservant who was emancipated in Jerusalem. V'hishkuha Shemaya v'Avtalion. And it turns out that Shemaya and Avtalion, the Nasi and the Av Beit Din of the Sanhedrin, gave her waters of the soita waters to drink. V'omar lahem, and he said to them, Dugma hishkuha, a sample, so you have given her. In other words, what does it mean, a sample? There are different interpretations. One interpretation says that when they gave it to her, they didn't really give the proper soita waters, but rather they just made up something so that people would see as if the event was happening. That is one interpretation. But the interpretation that we're looking at over here says that she was similar to them, which means to say what? Shmaya and Avtalion were both, of course, from families of converts. And since she herself is similar in category to this, which means to say that she herself is a freed maidservant in a similar type of situation. So it says over here that V'omar lahim, and he said to them, Dugma hishkuha, you are similar, and so therefore that is why you gave the waters. V'niduhu, and so they put him into excommunication. They took Akavia ben Mahalalel and they put him into excommunication. Umeis benidio, and he died in his excommunication. V'saklu Beit Din es arono, and the Beit Din stoned his coffin. Interesting idea, whole story over here. So basically what happened is Akavia ben Mahalalel questioned the behavior of Shmaya and Avtalion. He spoke in other words, a disrespectful manner towards the rabbis, the leading sages of the generation. And as a result, because he questioned them in a way that showed he did not respect their teachings, therefore they put him into excommunication. And he himself, of course, was a very great man. Now, it says over here that the Beit Din stoned his coffin. Many people know there's a custom when one goes to the cemetery that we place stones on the gravestone of the person who's buried there. The custom is we usually take a stone and we put the stone on top of the grave, on top of the stone. Or alternatively, some people even make a little sound and they tap on it as if to say, hello, I'm here, whatever it may be. The question is, where did this custom ever come from? There are many people that say the custom came from this very teaching, the Gemara, and the next Gemara teaching that we're going to read in just a moment, about the concept of stoning. That the idea of how do you stone the coffin? You put a stone on it. What is the stone the symbol of? It's a symbol of, so to speak, stoning the person, as if to say that the person was responsible maybe of a particular aveira. He was liable to be stoned. So we kind of take a stone in a way and say this should be the final repair. There should be no need for real stoning, but this is the way that we do it. We simply put a stone on as if to indicate that this person could have possibly died through stoning. Well, that's just a particular idea. It's shared in many sources, and it's just a particular idea which I'm sharing with you. Let us take a look at some of these notes before we continue to the next part. So perhaps he has repented. We spoke about the Torah scholar, and we said that even one who sees the Torah scholar committing an aveira in the daytime, we should not think badly of him. Probably he's already done teshuvah. By the time we're thinking about all the bad that he's done, he's already done teshuvah. It is to be understood as follows. One who sees a Torah scholar sin should not think badly of him. One must assume that the scholar certainly, and not just might have repented. What is nidoi, ostracism? Ostracism is a lesser degree of excommunication. The primary halachot that apply at this level of excommunication are that the individual must conduct himself as if he is in mourning, and he is not included in a prayer quorum. Those people who know, there are many Beit Dinim today who also put people into a state of excommunication or ostracism, whichever level we're talking about, due to various things. The rabbis are entitled to do this under certain circumstances. And one of the things that they can do to this person is that they can exclude him from all prayer services with a minyan, which means to say they can say to him, even if you go and daven with the minyan, you will not be counted in the minyan. If there are only 10 people there and he is one of them, the community is instructed that they are not to accept him as part of the minyan, and it's as if there still isn't a minyan. That is one of the things that can happen to a person who is put into this nidoi, or this ostracism, as they say here, or the excommunication, as we're discussing. So, number one, he should behave as if he is in mourning, and he is not included in a prayer quorum. This does not preclude the individual, however, from hiring laborers or hiring himself out as a laborer. In that sense, it is business as usual. The same is true in terms of studying and teaching Torah. On the other hand, one who does not take the necessary steps to have his ostracism lifted is then excommunicated. At that stage, all contacts with him are severed. The courts resorted to ostracism primarily in two cases: when an individual failed to pay his debts and there were no other measures at the disposal to compel him to pay, or as a punishment for disparaging the Torah or Torah scholars. Now here we see they required her to drink the potion because she was like them. What does that mean? Some explain the phrase to mean that instead of the actual bitter waters, they had her drink colored water in order to scare her into confessing. According to Akavia, they did so because, as descendants of converts themselves, they did not want it publicized that a convert does not drink the bitter waters. He was ostracized, either for casting aspersion upon them or for suspecting that they acted improperly as a substitution of colored water for the bitter waters was liable to lead people to treat the actual bitter waters with disdain. The personalities, who was Akavia ben Mahalalel, he was one of the first Tanaim and a contemporary of Hillel the Elder, some 100 years before the destruction of the temple. Akavia ben Mahalalel maintained stringent opinions that were at odds with most of the sages of his generation. His eminence in Torah is evidenced by the fact that his fellow sages told him that if he reneged upon 3 laws that they found unacceptable, he would be appointed head of the Beit Din of Israel. He famously replied, "I would rather be called a fool for my entire life than be wicked for a single hour." This firmness was based upon his piety and a profound fear of heaven, as well as the conviction that he must pass on the halacha as he received it from his teachers. However, he told his son, who was also a sage, to accept the opinion of the majority. Few of his halachic and agadic statements are recorded in the Mishnah. Language, like them, dugma. The word dugma, which means like them or an example, comes from the Greek deigma, meaning form or sample. Some, based on parallel sources, have a variant reading, duchma or dukma, from this Greek word dokima, if that's how it's pronounced, dokime, meaning test. Let's look at the halacha. 24 places in which the court ostracizes over matters of respect due to the rabbi. One who speaks disparagingly after the beer. It is incumbent upon the court to ostracize one against whom there is testimony that he maligned a Torah scholar, even if he only did so verbally or not in his presence. His ostracism is not lifted until he appeases the scholar on whose account he was excommunicated. If he maligned a Torah scholar after his death, the court ostracizes him until he repents. Administering the bitter waters to a convert or an emancipated maidservant. A convert and an emancipated maidservant are administered the bitter water portion just like any other Jewish woman, in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, who constitute the majority in the dispute with the lone dissenting opinion. So is the halakha in accordance with the rabbis after all, and not in accordance with the opinion of Akavia ben Mahalalel. Mahi. The Gemara continues to the next level. What is the situation of a person who demeans washing one's hands? Can you give me an example? Ditnan, as we learned in a Mishnah, Omar Rabbi Yehuda said, Chas v'shalom, God forbid, Chas v'shalom, pity and peace. God forbid. She'akavia ben Mahalalel nisnada. Don't think for a second that Akavia ben Mahalalel was put into excommunication, where he was ostracized. She'eina zara ninelet al kol adam b'Yisrael, because the courtyard was not locked on any Jewish person, b'chochma u'v'tara u'b'yireschet, in wisdom, in purity, and the fear of heaven. Ka'akavia ben Mahalalel, like such an individual, like Akavia ben Mahalalel, he was so great. Ele es minido, but who is it then that they put into, that they ostracized? Es Elazar ben Chanoch. It was Elazar ben Chanoch. What did he do wrong? Shepikpeik ben etilas yadayim, that he was hesitant, he was doubtful about washing one's hands. Ukeshemes, and when he died, Shalchu Beit Din, the Beit Din sent, V'inichu even gedola al arona, and they placed a big stone on his coffin. See here again, we see the same example of the stone on the coffin. It seems to be some sort of a message of the soul of the person. He dies, and then after he dies, they kind of put a stone there. L'lamedcha, to teach you. Shekola misnadeh umeis beniduyo, anybody who was ostracized and he died in the state of being ostracized, Beit Din solkim is arono. The Beit Din, they stone his coffin. So we see over here another reason as to why they would put the stones on, and perhaps it became a custom amongst the Jewish people when they saw this being done. Perhaps they even thought it was praiseworthy to put a stone on a person's coffin, and so from that moment onwards, every time we go and visit somebody who died, we put a stone on top of the grave. Of course, practically speaking today, we're not speaking badly about them. In fact, on the contrary, those people who do go to cemeteries, and especially when they visit Tzadikim and that, so you'll notice that there are often very many stones on top of the gravestone, and that is a sign that there are many people that have come to visit this particular person. So today, in a certain respect, when the stone is put there, it's really a sign of respect, because when other people walk past, they realize that somebody else has come to visit this person and give honor to that person who had passed on. Okay, let's take a look here. One who demeans the ritual washing of the hands, one must be vigilant with regard to the ritual washing of the hands, as the court is required to ostracize anyone who demeans that ritual. One, i.e., one who never in his life did so. He will become impoverished and be uprooted from the world, in accordance with the Mishnah cited here. One who is ostracized and dies in a state of ostracism, the court stones his coffin. One who is ostracized due to contempt for Torah and mitzvahs and dies in that status, the court places a stone on his coffin. His relatives do not rend their clothing, he is not eulogized, and none of the rites instituted to honor the deceased are practiced. On the other hand, consoling the mourners, which is to honor the living, is permitted. The Gemara continues. Hameikis daito klape maila. Somebody who acts in a haughty manner towards heaven. What is it? What is it? Give us an example. Ditnan, as we learnt in the Mishnah. Shalach lo Shimon ben Shatach lechoni hamagel. Shimon ben Shatach. He sent for Choni, the circle maker. Everybody knows the famous stories about Choni, the circle maker. Most famous story, of course, is when the Jewish people didn't have rain, that Choni hamagel, Choni, the circle maker, he drew a circle and then he stepped inside of the circle and he shouted out to God in his prayers, in his demands, and he said to God, I will not leave the circle until it begins to rain. So of course, God loved this Choni hamagel very much, and therefore what he did was a few drops of rain came out from the sky. Then Choni hamagel started laughing and he said, how can this be, God? Do you think this is a joke? We need rain, not just one or two drops. And suddenly the whole area became flooded with water coming down, in accordance with the prayer of Choni hamagel. And of course, Choni hamagel turned back to God and he says, this is nonsense. You think I'm going to get out of the circle because all of a sudden this storm and this flood is coming? That's not what we want. We want proper rain, blessed rain. And at that point in time, the Gemara tells us that God blessed them and they all had this wonderful rain on the merits of Choni hamagel. So according to Shimon ben Shatach, he called for Choni hamagel and he says to him, isn't it true basically that you yourself acted in a haughty manner towards heaven? Who has the chutzpah to talk to God in this way? You draw a circle in the middle of the ground, and then you say to God, I will not leave this circle until it begins to rain because we need rain. Who is so haughty to talk to God in such a way, as if his prayer is going to be answered? He's such a great man. So Shimon ben Shatak said to Choni Amagel, you are deserving to be ostracized. If you were not Choni, I would have decreed upon you excommunication. I would have ostracized you. Aval, ma e'eseh? But what can I do? Says Shimon ben Shattach. She'ata mitchatei lifnei hamakom. You are acting like a spoiled child in front of Hashem. This is literally the translation of this expression, mitchatei lifnei hamakom. You act towards God like a spoiled brat, like a spoiled child. And he does for you your will. Kaven, just like a son, like a son who acts in a spoiled manner towards his father. And what does the father do? He does the will of his son. And upon you, the verse says, may your father be happy, and your mother, and may the one who has given birth to you rejoice. So we see over here that Choni was considered like a spoiled child by Hashem, and whenever he would just call out to Hashem, asking for whatever it was that he wanted, God would say, it's like as if, so to speak, you're my only son. What else have I got left? I'm going to give you everything. So you sit and cry, so I'll give you whatever you want. So Shimon ben Shatak said to him, if you were not Choni, the spoiled child of Hashem, I would have ostracized you already, because your behavior is not befitting towards heaven. But in general, a person who acts in a haughty manner towards heaven is deserving to be ostracized. V'tu leika, the Gemara asks, and are there no more cases further than this? There isn't. V'ha'ikeh detane Rav Yosef, but there is this case that Rav Yosef taught. Totos ish Romi. There was this man, his name was Theodosius of Rome, and hinhig et b'nei Romi la'achilan gedayim mekulasim, and he accustomed his way with the people of Rome to feed them whole kids, in other words, whole goats, young goats that were roasted with the entrails over their heads, as was the custom when roasting the Paschal lamb. So he gave them this opportunity, and they're going to be able to do this roasting in this particular way. B'leila Pesachim, on the eve of Pesach. Shalach le Shimon ben Shattach. Here's another story. What happened? Shimon ben Shattach sent for Todos, the Roman. Il male Todos ata. If you were not Todos ata, so gozrani alecha, I would have decreed upon you nidoi, ostracism. She'ata ma'achilet Yisrael kodashim b'chutz, because you are feeding the Jewish people the holy offerings outside of the temple area. So therefore we see here is another case where Shimon ben Shattach was ready to put Todos into to be ostracized, but he didn't do so because Todos was this great man, and so therefore he had this to his favor, and he wasn't ostracized. The Gemara continues, the Mishnah Seinu ka'amrinan. We're speaking about our Mishnah. V'habraitahi, and what you're talking about here is a braita, which means it's not fair to use this as an example of a situation of showing disrespect to heaven. We were speaking about 24 cases as brought down in the Mishnah. But this teaching over here that we read relates to a braita. Therefore, it's not good enough. We want teachings that relate to the Mishnah. So the Gemara continues. Uvemasnisin leika. Are there no more examples in the Mishnah? V'ha'ikra. Here is another one. Haditnan, that we learned in the Mishnah. Chatacho chuliyot. They cut up. He cuts up. One who cuts up cut an earthenware oven horizontally into ring-shaped pieces. V'nasan chol ben chulia lechulia. And then he places sands between each of these links, each of these twirly things that he does for the oven. Rabbi Eliezer metaher. Rabbi Eliezer says that this oven is pure. Famous story in the Gemara. V'chachamim metamim. And the Chachamim said that such an oven is impure. Everybody knows the famous story that took place over here where Rabbi Eliezer began to engage all the forces of creation to prove that his opinion was correct. And indeed, all of the forces of creation proved that Rabbi Eliezer's opinion was correct. But in spite of this all, a voice came out, even a voice came out and said that Rabbi Eliezer's opinion was correct and so on. But the sages says, Lo b'shamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven, and therefore, since the Chachamim have the final ruling on the matter, and the majority rules, and the Chachamim said that such an oven is considered to be impure, so therefore the opinion of the Chachamim counts, and even though Rabbi Eliezer was certainly correct with everything that he said, and all the forces of creation proved that he was correct, nevertheless we do not fulfill the halacha in accordance with individual opinion, and we do not fulfill the halacha in accordance with the word of heaven. We fulfill the halacha in accordance with what the rabbis teach. So the Chachamim said it is impure. V'zer tanuro shel achnai, and this was known as the oven of achnai. In Aramaic, the word achna means a snake, and it was also in the place called achnai, but there was in other words, a play on the word tanuro shel achnai. It was the oven of achnai. It was the oven of the snake. Why a snake? My achnai. Why was it called a snake? What is the meaning of this achnai? Even though it was also achnai, the name of the place, but why did they call it the name of by this name of the snake? Omar Rav Yehuda, because Rav Yehuda said, Omar Shmuel. He said that Shmuel said, Melamed. It comes to teach shehikifuhu halachot ka'achnai ze v'timuhu, that the rabbis encircled Rabbi Eliezer with halachot like a snake going around and around and around, like the snake, and they made it impure. And therefore, they declared this oven to be impure against the wishes of Rabbi Eliezer, who held something which proved that indeed the tanur was pure, but they surrounded him like a snake. And so the whole scenario, this whole story, was known as the tanuro shel achnai. Let us just see the notes that we've missed out. Eating whole kids on the eve of Passover. It is prohibited on Passover Eve to eat a goat that was roasted whole, as it appears as if one is eating consecrated food outside the temple. Whether or not one is permitted to eat the meat if it was sliced and then roasted depends upon the local custom. What is the oven of achnai? An oven that was cut into segments, and sand was placed between the segments. If he subsequently plastered the surface of the oven, it has the legal status of a vessel and is susceptible to ritual impurity, as per the opinion of the rabbis against Rabbi Eliezer. Now, who was this fellow Theodosius Theodosius of Rome, who lived in the time of Shimon ben Shattach and King Alexander Yanai, was apparently the leader of the Jewish community in Rome. He was also charged with overseeing the transport of Jewish contributions to the temple and the sages. Theodosius was also a sage, as evidenced by the inclusion in the Gemara of one of his Agadic statements with regard to the sanctification of God's name. Due to his renown and status as a leader, Shimon ben Shattach adopted a tone of respect when addressing him and did not excommunicate him. Here we see the beauty over here of the Steinsaltz Koren Talmud Bavli that we're using. You can see more or less what this oven looked like in those days. It didn't look like the ovens that we have today, as you can imagine. It was done it was made out of earthenware, and this is basically what it looked like. According to Rabbi Eliezer, if an oven was cut according to the parallel lines in the illustration, it is considered a broken vessel, incapable of contracting ritual impurity, even if it was later reassembled. Such is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer against the opinion of the Chachamim. Now we have a big problem over here. Let me just point out here that Rabbi Eliezer, we know who Rabbi Eliezer was. Rabbi Eliezer was in fact one of the teachers of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva had two main teachers. One was Rabbi Eliezer, one was Rabbi Yeshua. We know that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus, as he was known, that was his name, actually came from a very wealthy family, and until the age of about 27, he did not know any Torah, and ultimately he loved Torah and he wanted to study Torah. What did he do? He went off and he found a teacher for himself, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai taught him Torah until he became the great sage Rabbi Eliezer, who would ultimately become the teacher of Rabbi Akiva. Now, this same Rabbi Eliezer that we're speaking about is the same person who went against the wishes of the Chachamim, and he pronounced this particular oven to be kasher, to be tamei, even though they had all said that it was in fact tahor, it was in fact pure, and therefore he went against him. This is the Rabbi Eliezer that we're speaking about here. V'tanya, and it was taught in a brisa. Oisoi hayom heviu kol taharos shetiher. On that very day, they brought all the pure things, shetiher Rabbi Eliezer, that Rabbi Eliezer had before this already pronounced as being pure. Usrafum kol taharos shetiher, that Rabbi Eliezer had declared ritually pure. And what did they do? Usrafum lefanav, and they burnt it all in front of him. Because he did not accept the decision of the majority, so they burnt this in front of him. Ulebesof berchuhu, and in the end they blasphemed him, or they blessed him, or they ostracized him, whatever we translate this word as, which means to say that they ultimately put him into excommunication. And that was the sad story about Rabbi Eliezer, who basically died in a state of ostracism against the rabbis due to this whole story taking place. Avilu haki, even so, nidoi b'masnisin lotnan. Even so, the Gemara says, we did not learn this ruling with regards to the ostracism in the Mishnah. But tell me, the Gemara says, in 24 places, where are you possibly going to find all of this concept of the ostracism in the 24 places? Where do you find it? The answer is Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi medameh milta lemilta. What Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi did when he said that there are 24 cases is he compared one story to another, one thing to the other, one situation to another situation. And as a result, he was able to draw out 24 different situations. For Rabbi Elazar, but when it came to Rabbi Elazar, we know he only found 3. Lo medameh milta lemilta. So he did not compare one thing to the other, and therefore he was not able to find the 24 cases. The Gemara continues back to the language of the Mishnah. Noisei hamita v'chilufeihin, those who are carrying the coffin and those who then substitute for them. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught in the Brisa, ein moitzim es hameis, we don't take out the dead person samuch lekriyat Shema, when it's close to the time of reciting the Kriyat Shema. That is not the time to bury the deceased, because the mitzvah of reciting Kriyat Shema takes precedence at that point in time, and therefore we shouldn't, at that point, we shouldn't go and take out the deceased and deal with the burial, because once you do so, you're already going to cause a problem, because the time for saying Kriyat Shema might pass by. So the moment it's time to say Kriyat Shema, deal with the Kriyat Shema, and then afterwards bury the person. It's just a few minutes later. V'im hitchilu, however, if they began already to take out the coffin, ein mafsikin, so then we don't stop them. Once, if they're ready to start to take him out, we don't stop any. The Gemara says, is that so? That we don't stop. Actually, we know the story that with regards to Rav Yosef, they took him out close to the reciting of the Kriyat Shema. They went against this idea. Even though the halacha says we don't take out the deceased close to the time of Kriyat Shema, nevertheless, when it came to Rav Yosef, they did this very thing for him. What's the answer to the problem? Why did they do this? Adam Chashuv Shani, because an important person is different. And therefore, they were showing honor to kavod, to this great individual who had died. And even though it was close to the time of saying Kriyat Shema, nevertheless, they brought him out for burial immediately. The Gemara continues quoting from the words of the Mishnah. Shelifnei hamita v'shel achar hamita. Those are in front of the coffin and those who are behind the coffin. We're speaking about the responsibility of reciting the Kriyat Shema. And when a person is present at the funeral, to what degree is he chayev, obligated to recite the Kriyat Shema, because he is now taking part in a mitzvah of burying the dead? Perhaps he is exempt altogether. Perhaps there's a way he should recite the Kriyat Shema. These are the questions that we raised last time when we were discussing this Mishnah. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught in the Brisa, ha'oiskim behesped, those people who occupy themselves with the eulogy, bisman shemeis mutal lifneihem, at the time that the deceased is placed in front of them, nishmatin echad echad v'korin, then each person should leave one by one and they should read, which means to say, you can imagine the story taking place over here, that the coffin is brought out and they are now eulogizing the deceased before the burial takes place. And people are crowding around, people are seated, people are standing. What people should do is they shouldn't all sit there when the eulogy is taking place, but rather they should leave one at a time, recite the Kriyat Shema, and then return back. It's true, they might miss out on certain words of the eulogy, but there's no real mitzvah to listen to every single word of the eulogy taking place here, but there is certainly a mitzvah to recite the Kriyat Shema in its correct time. Therefore, each person should leave, recite the Kriyat Shema, and then return back again, and somebody else will go out again the next time. Ein hameis mutar lifneihem. However, if the dead person is not placed in front of them, then this is what they should do. Hein yoshvin v'korin, they should sit and read the Kriyat Shema because the dead person is not there, the deceased is not in their presence. V'hu yoshev, and the person who's the mourner, he sits v'domem, and he is silent. He is not going to recite the Kriyat Shema, he simply remains silent. Heim omdim umispalelin, they stand up and they daven, they're going to daven the Shmona Esrei. V'hu omeid, and he also stands, but he's not davening. Umatzdika lavet hadin, and he accepts the judgment upon himself. Matzdika lavet hadin means to say that he accepts, he acknowledges the judgment that was given to him. When a person, God forbid, loses a relative, it is a powerful judgment to that person. One day the person had that other person in their lives, and the next day they've lost them. You can imagine, of course, if a person loses money, he has a robbery and he loses money, this is called din. Hashem took out a judgment against the person, and as a result, the money was stolen from him. Well, kal vachomer, all the more so when we speak about a person losing somebody who's close to one, that too, of course, is a din against the person. Now, when that happens, what this person has to do is he has to get to a point where he acknowledges, where he realizes, he says to himself, I acknowledge that God is in charge of judgment. And at this point in time, he has brought a judgment not just upon the person that has died, but he has brought a judgment against me because I have lost out on that person who is a part of my life. V'omer. Now the Gemara continues and says, how does he accept the judgment against him? He should say the following words. He says, Ribon ha'olamim, master of worlds, harbei chatati lefanecha, I have sinned a lot before you. V'non nifra'at mimeni, but you haven't taken retribution against me. Echad mini elef, even 1 in 1,000. Listen to the words carefully again. We'll say it slowly. He accepts the judgment and he says to God in his way of acceptance, God, the truth of the matter is, I've sinned so much that even if we take into account this little thing, so to speak, that has happened in my life, that I've lost this particular person in my life, still, God, you have not taken retribution against me, even 1 in 1,000, which means what? I'm liable for so much wrong that I've done in my life. And what is this really? Therefore, he accepts the judgment against him. Yehi ratzon milfanecha, may it be the will before you, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem our God, shetigdor pirtzoseinu, that you should fence in our breaches, repair our breaches, or pirtzos kolamcha beis Yisrael, and the breaches of all of your nation, the house of Israel, berachamim, in mercy. This is how he accepts upon himself the judgment that has been taken against him by claiming, according to the words of the Gemara, that God has not even executed the worthiness of 1 in 1,000 of what is really due to this individual for all the terrible things he might have done wrong. Omar Abaye said, Lo mi baye leile inash lemeimar haki. Abaye was smart. He says, a person is not required to say such things. A person should never say such things. To Omar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, because Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, V'chein tana mishmei de Rabbi Yesi, and so it is taught also in the name of Rabbi Yesi, le'olam, forever, always, al yiftach adam piv leSatan. A person should never open his mouth up for the Satan. Which means to say, this is a very famous teaching brought here in this Gemara. It is not for us to ever assume that we are more liable for something, even when tragedy hits us. No person should ever open up their mouth and say, "Oh, I have done such terrible things wrong in my life. Maybe God should exact retribution against me for all of these things. Surely I'm liable." Well, of course, one should never say that to another person. But in any case, one should never say to oneself either. Sometimes a person can become particularly frustrated in life. And after a while, he starts to say to himself, perhaps I'm an awful person. Perhaps God hasn't even taken retribution out on me 1 in 1,000. I'm so much liable for so many terrible things I've done. Those who study Musar will know such an approach. Such an approach speaks about where a person begins to castigate himself. He begins to say, I'm such a terrible person. I've done such terrible things in my life. And look at this. God still rewards me. He gives me all these things. I'm so liable for so many things. God should hold me liable for them. He gets himself into a rut. He gets himself all caught up. And this is a terrible thing. And Abaya says a person should never talk this way. Because Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, and it's also taught in the name of Rabbi Yesi, who says, Le'olam al yiftach adam piv lesatan. A person should never open his mouth up in awakening the possibility that he is liable for more retribution. Never should he say to somebody else, that person, a person is complaining. He says he can't afford his rent. He can't afford new garments, whatever it is. And somebody comes up and says, what? You can't afford a rent or new garments. And that's all. You're such a terrible person. You're not deserving of anything in your life. God should find you liable for more things. You should be grateful for all these things that you've got. This is not for somebody else to say to a person. If the person wants to work on themselves and they want to try to work out of their systems that perhaps God is giving them what he feels at this point in time is what he must do, it's up to the person to decide. But then let us not forget these teachings. It is never the right of a person to open up his mouth for the Satan, to awaken the Satan, that he should be found liable for things that perhaps he's not even liable for. We can get ourselves so caught up that eventually we become so antagonistic towards ourselves. We're working on ourselves so much. We start to say, my word, we say, perhaps I'm liable for more things, for worse. This is not the correct approach to have in life ever. V'omar, Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef said, my kra'ah, what is the verse that proves this? Shenemar, because it says, a pasuk in the Torah, Kim'at biskisdom hayinu. This is brought down in the book of Yeshayahu, and the people are talking to the prophets, and they say, it's almost like as if we were like the people of Sodom. You know, Sodom and Amorah were a terrible group of people, a terrible city filled with evil. So the people were talking to the prophet and they said, you know, we were like as bad as Sodom, something that they shouldn't have said. My ahadar lahu navi, what did the prophet answer back to them? Shemu dvar Hashem ketzinei Sodom. Listen to the word of Hashem, you leaders of Sodom, which means they got back what was due to them, which means to say that he was throwing back in their face exactly what they were saying. If you really believe that, I'm going to tell you that that's really who you are. So once a person begins to talk in a way of negativity against himself, he can even awaken this force of the Satan against himself. On the contrary, number one, he should judge himself in a favorable light. He should judge other people in a favorable light. And when he looks at his situation, even if he imagines that he might have done something that was so terrible, he should not open up his mouth and express the terrible thing he did in a way that can awaken additional punishment against him for this particular thing. That is not for us to do. We live in a world that God affects us already enough. We have enough problems, enough difficulties. When God decides to give us difficulties, he decides in any case, it is not for us to awaken difficulties neither upon other people nor upon ourselves by assuming that because we might have done certain things wrong, therefore we are liable for the worst possible punishments that the world has ever imagined. God forbid. Kovru, let us read the notes up until this point. So the deceased may not be taken out to be buried adjacent to the time for the recitation of Shema. The deceased may not be taken out for burial adjacent to the time when Shema must be recited, so that its recitation will not be abrogated. If the funeral procession already began, it is not interrupted to recite Shema. Nowadays, the custom is that even an important person is not taken out for burial adjacent to the time when Shema must be recited, brought in the name of the Taz. There are those who are lenient with regard to the nighttime Shema. They begin the funeral procession adjacent to the time of its recital because one has the whole night to recite the Shema, and in order to avoid delaying the burial until the next day. This opinion was cited by the Ramah and adopted by the Magen Avraham, and here are the sources. For those people wondering about this particular paragraph we just read, let us not forget that certainly in Jerusalem, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's all of Israel, but certainly Jerusalem, that if a person dies at night, the burial takes place immediately, as soon as possible. We do not delay even for over the evening that the person should be buried the next day. Burial should happen as fast as possible, as close to the time of the death as possible. In Chutz La'aretz, they're not careful about this at all, and even if a person dies, they sometimes wait, God forbid, a few days until the person is buried. This, of course, should be avoided at all costs, unless it is absolutely urgent that such a thing take place. But in general, we want to bury the body as soon as possible, so that the person, as soon as the body is buried, the soul may be released completely and ascend to its particular station in the world above. Those involved in a eulogy with regard to reciting Shema, if the deceased was laid out before those engaged in eulogizing him, they slip out one at a time and recite Shema and pray. If the deceased is not before them, they recite Shema and pray where they are assembled, with the exception of the mourner who sits in silence, as we said. What is this concept here? One must never open his mouth to the Satan, Le'olam, al yiftach adam piv le-Satan. It is inappropriate for one to say that God has not punished him enough for his sins, as he thereby opens his mouth to Satan, as per the statements of Abaye and Reish Lakish. The Gemara continues. Here, notes, one must never open up his mouth to Satan. The reason is that once a person justifies God's judgment, there is no more room for the attribute of mercy to be applied in this case. However, this restriction applies only to the future. But with regard to the past, it is an act of righteousness to declare that God punished him for his sins, which means to say that was accepting the judgment. If the action already happened and the person already died, and now they're being buried, we say to God, it must be that I also did something wrong, and therefore I've experienced this loss in my life. It is a judgment against me for whatever it is I've done wrong. However, that does not entitle us or awaken within us or cause us that we should start now assuming that we should go off on a tangent, saying, you know what, maybe I've done even worse. Maybe God should find me liable for even worse things, etc., etc. Okay, so the Gemara continues back into the words of the Mishnah. Kavru es hameis v'chazru. They buried the dead and then they returned back. The Gemara says, Im yacholim latchil v'ligmor es kula. If they're able to begin and finish off everything, meaning to say the whole Kriyat Shema, certainly yes, they should do it. Aval perek echad or pasuk echad lo. But if they're just going to recite one chapter or even one pasuk, one verse, no, you should not do that. You should return back to the place in line where you have to be and stay there, because you have to get back as soon as possible. You can't sit and say the entire Kriyat Shema. Uriminu, the Gemara raises a contradiction. Kavru, what does it say in another brisa? The other brisa teaches the following. Kavru is hamet. If they buried the dead, v'chazru, and they returned. Im yacholim latchil v'ligmor afilu perek echad or pasuk echad. In another brisa, it says, if they are able to begin and complete even one chapter, even one verse, they may do so, and they may begin and fulfill that. Let us take a look over here. I think there was a note somewhere. They buried the deceased and returned. If those who returned from the burial and are proceeding to form a row to console the mourners have enough time to recite even the first verse of Shema, they should begin and recite as much of Shema as they can, says the Bach. Some say that once they begin, they should recite Shema in its entirety, says the Beis Yosef. If there is concern that the time for reciting Shema will pass, they should recite it, as per the Breita and the Gemara's conclusion. Brought down there in the Rambam, as you can see in the Shulchan Aruch, if you want to see the halacha for yourself. Hakinam hikamar. So too over here they said, Im yacholim lahatchil v'ligmor afilu perek echad or afilu pasuk echad. If they'll be able to start and complete even one chapter or even one verse, ad shelo yagliu l'shura, before they can come back to the row, yatchilu, they should begin. V'im lav, and if not, lo yatchilu, they shouldn't begin. Okay, and here we are starting now on page Yutet Amud Beis. And of course, we're going to stop right here. It's an excellent place to stop. We've reached the start of the next page. We've also reached another point in the Mishnah, discussing a new issue over here, continuing within the words of the Mishnah. So we're not going to continue. I thank you very much for joining me. I hope that you've enjoyed this shiur. I'm Eliyahu Shir from Chesed Ve'emet. My site can be found on www.lovingkindness.co. If you've enjoyed the shiur, please subscribe to my channel. Please like the shiur by clicking on the thumbs up button below on the YouTube. Underneath there's a thumbs up. Please click that button. You'll be helping me. Feel free to make a comment. You're also helping me by making comments and getting a discussion going. I'm happy to hear what you have to say and to reply. And let's talk about the page that we're learning, your insights, what you've learned from this, what you've got out from this, how you've found it beneficial. Whatever you have on your mind, please do share. I'd be delighted to find out what you're gaining from these shiurim. Please do share these shiurim with family and friends and help me to expand my channel, to get more subscribers and to have more people watching these videos, which is really my goal. That's how you can help me if you'd like to. I look forward to another shiur, and as always, my email is available and open, and you're welcome to be in touch. Just visit my site and send me an email with your thoughts, questions, growth, Torah, life, whatever's on your mind, discussing the issues that we're talking about or all aspects of Torah, and I'd be delighted to be in touch with you on all of these areas. Thanks so much for joining me, and I look forward to another shiur in the near future, and I wish you everything of the best. Shalom, shalom. Bye-bye.